All right, 6 o'clock, it's time to start. Ladies and gentlemen, good evening and welcome to tonight's talk, both in person and online. Please note that this talk is recorded and it will be available publicly later. My name is Tiasha Whiteman and I am the chair of Sydney section of AIAA, the American Institute of Aeronautics and Astronautics. This talk tonight is hosted by AIAA and Royal Aeronautical Society. To a lot of people tonight, both online and here, myself included, this search is personal, as many of us have been, and we have looked for VH-MDX in Barrington's unforgiving environment. Everybody who has been involved in the past 40 years, and especially the families of the missing people, we hope that it can be found in the near future and that the remains can be returned soon. So our speaker tonight is Dr. Glen Horrocks. He's a Deputy Unit Commander of New South Wales Force Search and Rescue Unit, also commonly referred as BSAR. There's a few members in here tonight, so welcome. Glen has been a BSAR volunteer since 1992 and has been involved in pretty much all the major searches in New South Wales since. He's been working alongside other members on VH-MDX case since 1994, either as researcher, search commander, or search team leader. In his professional life, he's a mechanical engineer working on commercial and industrial printing systems and has a PhD in engineering. So without much ado, Glen, it's yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Tasha, and welcome everybody. So thank you for coming along. Good to see a lot of people in orange today. It's great to see. So today we're talking about VH-MDX, which is an unsolved mystery, which is 43-year-old now. So it's still out there and we're still looking for it. Let's see if it's going to let me go to the next slide. No, not yet. There we go. Excellent. So as Tash said, so I'm the Deputy Unit Commander of the New South Wales SES Bush Search and Rescue Unit, commonly known as BSAR. So we came out of the Confederation of Bushwalking Clubs back from 1936 is when we were first founded, and through a long, long history have now ended up as an SES unit, which we're proud to be. That's my volunteer role, and my professional job, well, I'm a mechanical engineer. I've got a PhD in fluid flow and heat transfer, so I've got a computer modelling background, which you'll see some details of that later on. And I've worked in race engines, automotive, inkjet printing technology since then. So that's my technical background. And for VH-MDX, well, the first time I went up there to look for it was in 1994. So it's been a long time heading up there looking for that aircraft, and that's what we'll be talking about tonight. And I should also mention, pretty much all the research I'm about to present tonight is by Glen Horrocks. So Glen Horrocks was the guy who did most of the research which I'll be presenting to you tonight. He is an amazing researcher who pulls up some amazing facts about the history of this event. And as you'll see, he's managed to really sort out fact from fiction. And we'll go into that as we go through the presentation. And a lot of the work which Glen's done has been put on that website, vhmdx.com.au. So many people like to have a look at the VH-MDX story and see what they can add to it. I strongly recommend you to have a look at that website there, because that's got a good summary of the best information which we know about the incident. And I'll also point out that everything I'm presenting tonight is based on our best understanding of the evidence we know at the moment. If anyone comes up with some new evidence, which means that what I'm saying could be incorrect, I'd love to hear it. And one thing we can be sure now is that everyone who's had a theory up until this point has been wrong, because no one's found it yet. What was VH-MDX? It was a Cessna 210 Centurion. So you've got the dimensions of the aircraft there. So it's about 11.2 metre wingspan. It's a piston engine Cessna, single engine. It was the 9th of August of 1981. It was flying from Coolangatta to Bankstown. It was a charter flight. There was 5 persons on board and it never made it. So we're now going to do a bit of detail about those facts. So first of all, the people. So the pilot was Michael Hutchins. don't have the photo of Michael Hutchins, but that was the 4 passengers. So it was Noel Wildash, Ken Price, Rhett Bolster, Philip Pembroke. They had just been on a yachting holiday in the Whitsundays, and they decided to charter an aircraft to come back to Sydney, back home. So Michael Hutchins was the pilot who came with that chartered aircraft. So the pilot, Michael Hutchins, he was 52 years old. He was a professional pilot. He had a senior commercial pilot's license with an instrument rating, and he had thousands of hours experience on a variety of aircraft. So he was a very experienced pilot, and there's certainly nothing untoward with his experience or qualifications. So he was certainly a suitable pilot for what he was flying. And the aircraft, and I'm focusing here on things which are particularly relevant to what ended up happening to VH-MDX. It was fitted with a vacuum-powered artificial horizon and direction indicator. So the artificial horizon is the instrument on the aircraft which tells it its attitude, whether it's rolling and whether it's pitching up or pitching down. And pilots use that to keep the aircraft flat and level. The direction indicator, and so that one is so that they know which direction they're turning. And both of those in the Cessna 210 are powered by a vacuum pump. And both of those instruments were reported to have failed during the flight. It had an electrically powered turn at the coordinator, and so that helps the pilot do a coordinated turn when they're banking the aircraft. And you'll notice that it's not a vacuum-powered device. That's why we think that device was working through the entire flight. It had a roll axis autopilot. That's significant because he ends up flying into cloud, and the only way he's going to be able to keep the aircraft flat and level with no artificial horizon is by using the autopilot. So we're quite sure that the autopilot got extensive use through this. And he also had an ELT, or emergency location transmitter. They're meant to be triggered by G forces. So when there's an impact, they're meant to trigger. But clearly in this case, it did not trigger. There were several aircraft over the possible crash site almost immediately after the accident, and there was no pickup of any ELT signal. And a final point I make is the aircraft was instrument rated. So the pilot was instrument rated and the aircraft was instrument rated. And that comes into the next slide, because this is the flight plan which VH-MDX submitted. So this was submitted to Coolangatta Airport and was his flight plan for his flight to Sydney. You can see that he's aiming at departing Coolangatta at 4:45 in the afternoon, arriving Bankstown 9:48. Sunset that day was 5:37. So most of the flight was going to be at night. But that little bit which I've got in the red box is particularly significant because that's the box where the pilot chooses what flight rules they're going to go under. So the key flight rules are IFR, which is instrument rated, and that means he's flying on the instruments. And the advantage of flying on the instruments is that you can fly through cloud or places where you can't see the horizon. If you're running under visual flight rules, then you must see the horizon. You can't get into a position where you're never seeing the horizon. If you look closely at that, it looks like he's ticked IFR, but then crossed it out and then ticked night VFR. And we have suspicions that his artificial horizon and his directional indicator was actually faulty before he started the flight. One of the other pilots of that charter company had reported some problems with those instruments. So we have reasonable suspicions that those two instruments weren't actually functioning at the start of the flight. And that's why he went IFR. Oh, no. That's right. I've got to be VFR. I've lost some instruments. I can't fly IFR on this flight. And I've labelled that factor 1 because whenever you have a disaster, there's always a couple of just little things which by themselves are nothing, but when they combine up, they cause a disaster. And so the loss of those two instruments, while by themselves wouldn't cause a problem, he's a pilot with plenty of experience and he'd be able to fly that aircraft without them. But when it combines with some of these other factors I'm about to show you, they ended up being the causing the disaster which happened that night. And that was the flight plan. Coolangatta, Port Macquarie, Taree, Singleton, Bankstown. So it's right down the coast, except at Williamtown. So around Williamtown, there's a restricted airspace around the RAF base there. So whenever they do RAF operations, they close that airspace and they don't let civilian aircraft in. And so to get around that, you can see that he's gone down the coast the whole way, except at Williamtown, and he's diverted inland to Singleton and then gone south to Sydney from there. So, so the key point is that the only bit where he's left the coast is to go around Williamtown. So what happened? So he was flying along and it was pretty routine to Taree, following the flight plan. It's all good. Air traffic control asked him if he wanted clearance to go through the Williamtown restricted airspace. MDX said yes. So that's a bit of a change to his flight plan, but you'd think that that's a good idea. If you're on the coast, let's just keep following the coast down. Now, when you're asking for clearance to do something like that, then air traffic control, back in 1981, it was a manual process. What they had to do is they had to look at other aircraft in the area. They had to look at what speed they were, where they were. So was VH-MDX going to catch up to them? Is there any other aircraft we've got to move you around? As it turned out, there was a couple of aircraft in the airspace at the time. In particular, there's one aircraft who was ahead of VH-MDX, which was slower. So VH-MDX was going to catch up to that one. So between Williamtown Air Traffic Control and Sydney Air Traffic Control, they were just working out whether they'd either put him at a different altitude so they could overtake no problems, or whether he'd be anyway. So they're sorting this out. This is what air traffic control does all day, every day. This is their job. It only takes them a minute or two to sort that out. But before they'd sorted that out, MDX said, rather than wait for the clearance, we'll just track by Craven. So in other words, if he had waited a few more seconds, he would have got the clearance. But he said, don't worry about it. I'll just go inland. And there's a little excerpt from the transcript from the air traffic control log there where he says that. So Mike Delta X-ray, rather than wait for clearance, we'll track by Craven, thank you. Okay, fair enough. But as I said, that really becomes the second factor. If he'd just waited those few extra seconds, he would have got the clearance down the coast and we wouldn't be talking about him tonight. So what actually happened? The red line there is his flight plan. So it's coming down the coast, past Taree, which has got the first box in the top right, across to Singleton, which is the box in the lower left, and then south to Sydney from there. So the red line is his intended track. The yellow line is, we don't have precise details of exactly where he is, but approximately where he tracked is the yellow line. So going through Taree, pretty much right on his flight plan. At Taree, he was looking for clearance to go through the restricted airspace, so he just stayed on that bearing. But then after a couple of minutes, he said, don't worry about it, I'll go inland. So he overshot his flight path by a small amount. So he got back across to his flight path, somewhere around about the Craven area. And then at the Craven area, something went wrong. As you can see, his flight plan his actual track goes pretty much in a westerly direction, whereas his intended track is in a southwesterly direction. And the question is, well, why would that be? And we contend that it's because of the non-directional beacons, or the NDBs. So the non-directional beacons are a radio transmitter which transmit on a frequency, and the aircraft has a radio direction finding thing, which relative to like for instance, if the NDB is straight ahead of you, then the needle will be straight up. If it's off to the right, it'll swing over here. It's a direction finding thing. So you swing it round until the needle is up. So it's just a simple radio direction finding thing, and you dial in the frequency you're tracking. So the Singleton NDB is on 290 kilohertz. The Scone NDB, 209. We think just he simply transposed the digits. So just a simple little typo. But because of that, he ended up going west rather than southwest. And what that did is it put him right over the high mountains of Barrington Tops rather than his intended track, which is over the foothills. So that's the third just little factor which really caused the disaster, because those three combination of things meant that he flew into the high altitude region of Barrington Tops, which, when we look at the next slide, we'll see that the weather on that night, there was a strong southwesterly wind A cold front had gone through a number of hours earlier, so it's not as if there was a cold front active at the time, but it's that very cold weather which is behind a cold front. There was cloud, rain and snow on the southwest side of the ranges. So that side of the ranges is facing the weather, so that gets all the cloud and snow. But the other side of the ranges is clear and dry because the orographic effect, as the air descends on the other side, the air is clear. And that's why the coast was actually clear and dry that night, but the mountains were cloudy. So if he'd stayed on the track, it would have been no problems whatsoever. But with the track he ended up doing, it flew him straight into the middle of the cloud, rain and snow over Barrington Tops. So this is a few key things which MDX said to air traffic control from the air traffic control log. The log is quite extensive, and if you look on the National Archives, you can get the full log, and it's quite lengthy. But these are some key things which MDX said from that point on. So at 1924, MDX, I'm in the clag, in other words, in cloud. And then shortly after, I've lost my H and DI, so artificial horizon directional indicator. And as we contend, we think he didn't have them at the start anyway. It's just that this is the first time he's actually said that. So the tower's come back to him and said, confirm in VMC, in other words, visual conditions. And he says negative. So that confirms that he's in cloud. 1934, picking up a fair amount of ice. Now, what ice does to an airfoil is it means that it increases your drag and it decreases your lift, which means that it's harder for the aircraft to stay in the air. It also means that it raises your stall point, which means that you've got to fly faster to make sure that the wing stays attached. So it has many implications. At this point in time, he still manages to do a climb. So he's still got enough lift that he can hold the weight and climb. But as you can see down in 1934, he's picked up more ice down there, and we'll show you the implications of that later on. Skipping back to 1935, MDX, cockpit fire, but I think we've resolved that little problem. So you can, that is the only mention of what happened there. We have no idea what happened there. Was it someone who just lit up a cigarette and then put it out? Or was it a real fire? We don't know. But it sounds like things are getting more and more stressed up there. Bad things are happening and things are getting a bit out of control. 1935, compass swinging like blazes. 1936, up and down like a yo-yo. At this point, he's flying over the high ridges of Barrington Tops. So the wind's going to be going up and down like this, and it's going to be buffeting the aircraft around with it. So a comment like that would be expected. 1937, we're having strife up here. And 1938, picking up icing. And meantime, while that's happening, so this is the comments in the air traffic control log from the air traffic control tower. So at 1931, so MDX says MDX is averaging somewhere around 220. So that's where he thinks he's going. But the tower then says he's turning on to about 150. In other words, where MDX thinks he's going and where he actually is going is miles off. So it's quite clear that he's having problems keeping the aircraft on a straight track. And that would link in with his compass flying all over the place because he's lost his directional indicator. A few minutes later, looks like he's heading about 120. And then at 1936, we have a key transmission, which is the Williamtown control tower, which is asked by Sydney control tower, can you see him? And he says, yes, 320 Willie at 45 nautical miles, MDX squawking code 3000. So there's plenty of air traffic control jargon in there. So that means 320 degrees magnetic from the Willie radar, Williamtown radar, 45 nautical miles, and squawking code 3000 means that, so there's two radar systems which are at play here. You've got the primary radar system and the secondary radar system. The primary radar system is the one everyone knows about, where it sends out a pulse, it reflects off the aircraft, you get the pulse back, you measure the time, that gives you the distance, and you work out the distance from that. So in terms of the aircraft's point of view, it's passive. You don't need to do anything. It's just a reflection of the radio wave off the aircraft. The secondary radar, what that does is that transmits a code to the aircraft. The aircraft receives that code and transmits a code back saying, with an ID. In this case, it's squawking code 3000. He was asked to squawk code 3000 by air traffic control so that air traffic can, because there's lots of dots all over the map, and they want to know which one is MDX. And when the secondary radar comes up, it puts a box over the return. So you've got all these returns all over the map, but one of them's got a box over it. And so then that's the one I'm talking about. So that's why it's squawking code 3000, so that he comes up on the secondary radar system, and of all the displays, all the returns on the display, he becomes clear which one he is. 1936 on 150, he's all over the place. So it's clear that he's wobbling around. They don't record in the air traffic control log exactly where he wobbled, so we don't really know. But it's quite clear between MDX's comments and the tower's comments that he's not doing a consistent track. He's going everywhere. And then 1938-48, that's the radar fade at Sydney. So that's the last time he was seen on the radar. And then there was 3 final transmissions from MDX, which are fundamental. So 1936-40, MDX transmitted his altitude as 7.5. About a minute later, 6.5, and about a minute later, 5,000. And so you've only got to draw a pretty simple little graph there of altitude versus time, and you can see that the blue line up there. And then you draw in the orange line, and that's the altitude of the Corker Lookout, which he's currently flying over. And then the grey line, which is the Glossoptops Plateau, which is the land he's approaching. And you can see that he's going to hit the ground in seconds based on his current rate of descent. So it's clear that with all the icing he's picked up, he just doesn't have enough lift to keep the aircraft in the air. He's going down and it's not going up. In other words, from the 5,000 transmission, the amount of time which he was still in the air is going to be seconds. And if he's lucky enough to be over valley, it might be 2 minutes, 3 minutes, but no longer than that. He's only got a couple of minutes before he's going to hit the deck. So the search. So as soon as VH-MDX did the 5,000 call, which was the final call he ever made, several air traffic control was trying to get him on the radio, never responded. Other aircraft tried to get him on the radio, no response from that either. So at least these 4 aircraft were immediately dispatched to go and investigate. So VH-ESV, which is a Cessna 402, that was refueling at Williamtown Airport at the time. Air traffic control asked that to investigate a reported fire just out of Craven. So he departed Williamtown at 20:45. He then circled the fire site a few times, determined that it was not an aircraft crash, and then flew back to Williamtown for 2250. VHFCD, that was a East West Airlines flight. Remember them, East West Airlines? The oldies might remember them. So a Fokker Friendship, that was flying Sydney to Port Macquarie. Air traffic control asked that to divert to Singleton and then to fly low and slow to Port Macquarie, in other words, at the lower safe altitude and at the slower speed they could do. And that also went right over the heart of the region where VH-MDX was lost, but they were unsuccessful, of course, as well. And there was QF-27, the Qantas Boeing 747. So I don't think there's been many 747s over Barrington before, but so this 747, we don't know where it was departing from. It was flying to Sydney, we know that. But we know it flew several passes in that 10-minute period, 1951 to 8 o'clock at flight level 210, which is 21,000 feet. It couldn't see anything and it tried the radio multiple times. We also know the police helicopter was dispatched as well, and we know it had a night sun, so the big floodlight thing on it. I've talked to the police about that, but the details of that flight have been lost, so I don't know exactly what they've done. But the key thing is that there's a lot of eyewitness reports of people seeing aircraft on the night of VH-MDX, and that a lot of people are completely certain they saw VH-MDX before it crashed. A good deal of them saw one of those 4 search aircraft, because you've got VH-MDX. We've had reports of someone who saw an aircraft circling an area. There you go. Yes, that's ESV. There was reports of a aircraft which was flying in a distressed manner and extremely noisily. Well, the Fokker Friendship's a big aircraft and it's flying low and slow. So, yep, that's it. No one's reported a 747. I think people could tell the 747. And the police helicopter with its massive searchlight, when it lights that up, it's just like a boom. So in some circumstances, that can look like an explosion. So a lot of eyewitness reports can actually be put down to those search aircraft. So a massive air and land search was started the next day. We don't have many of the records of what they searched at the time. That folder there is one of the search maps we've got over there. So that marks a couple of the areas which are searched, but most of the records are unfortunately lost. We know that there was hundreds of hours of aerial searching, both helicopter and fixed wing, and hundreds of ground searches. So it was a massive search and a lot of resources were spent on it. I know for the ground searches, now that I know Barrington well, when I look at the search areas the ground searches were allocated, they are impossibly large. There is just no way those areas were searched. In the times they had allotted, they would have had time to walk across at once, and that's about it. But be that as may, certainly they threw plenty of resources at it, but obviously nothing was found. Although I do note that one of the search helicopters crashed down near Dungog, and so then they had to rescue the search aircraft from Dungog as well. So this is Williamtown radar, because this really becomes now a story of the radars. So this is what the Williamtown radar looked like in 1981. The view we've got here is actually the approach plan. So plan position indicator is the actual display of the radar. The approach is the approach is where they're coordinating the aircraft coming in and going out. The tower is up the tower. They've got a slightly smaller, so it's not exactly the one, but that's basically the same display as what the Williamtown air traffic control operator reported. Now, the key things I want to show you is that now in yellow up in the top, you can see some sort of fuzzy blobs in the yellow circle. That's the Barrington tops. So that's returns from the Barrington tops, which is then coming up as returns on the radar. VH-MDX was in that region. So the V8, when he said, I see him at 320 at 45 nautical miles, it was in that stuff. You'll notice that the returns stop just on the inside there of the circle. That's because there's what's called an MTI, which is a moving track indicator. The moving track indicator means that unless the radar signal is moving, it removes it. So if you've got something like a mountain, which is going to be the same return every time, it removes that and only remains the things which are moving, which are the aircraft. But that only goes out to, I think it's 44 nautical miles. So the last couple of miles on this display doesn't have an MTI, which means that it gets the Barrington returns and it doesn't remove those. So the Barrington returns are removed inside 44 nautical miles, but left outside. And down in the red circle, you can see what some secondary radar returns look like. So just above the red circle, you can just see 3 little blobs by themselves. That's just a primary return by itself. And then in the red circle, you can see 2 little primary returns, but then they've got a box around them. That box is the secondary return. So as you can see, it's hard to work out exactly what's what on the primaries because there are blobs everywhere. But the secondary then puts a box around it and you go, yeah, that's it. So when VH-MDX was scorching 3000, it would have had a box around it like that. And that's how it would have been seen inside the mess up at Barrington Tops, is because of the box around it. And this is Sydney route surveillance radar. So this is the radar which the operator who's in Sydney Air Traffic Control Tower, he's monitoring from Sydney Airport all the way up to the Queensland border. So that display there covers all the way from Sydney up to the Queensland border. You'll see that it's a mosaic display. It's actually two radar heads which are combined. You can see that there's there's one circle which is centered around the bottom of the display, and then a second circle which is centered around the top. That's because the bottom display has its radar head at Sydney Airport, and the top display has its radar head at Round Mountain, which is near Dorrigo. And then this display then combines those two together and superimposes it, and that's called a mosaic display. But the key thing I want to show between this and the Williamtown one, so knowing that that covers all the way from Sydney to Queensland, you can see that reading that off accurately is going to be a challenge, particularly when you look at the size of some of those blobs. You're not going to be getting kilometre accuracy out of that. It's multiple kilometre accuracy because the radar just doesn't read down to that resolution. And if we just go back to the Williamtown one, again, you've got the same thing there where, again, reading those blobs really accurately is a challenge. This one is better than Sydney, granted, because it's a much more compact area and it seems to be a bit sharper as well. But when he says 320 at 45 nautical miles, you can see how placing that accurately is a challenge because reading that accurately is going to be difficult. And when he said 320 at 45, does that mean it's 320 plus or minus 1, plus or minus 5, plus or minus 10? There's a lot of variability there, which we just really don't know. So our research is suggesting that a lot of the emphasis, not all, but a lot of the emphasis on the original search back in 1981 assumed that the Williamtown radar was better and that's the one they should use because it was closer than the Sydney radar. And that means that it was very much focused on the 320 at 45 point, which means that the search areas they predominantly looked at were around that sort of area on the assumption that that was the final fix from Williamtown radar and that was pretty much where it went down. But from what we've seen, it appears that the Williamtown Air Traffic Control Officer was never actually officially interviewed as part of that search. So no one actually asked him, what did you see? Now, Keith Massey there, and that's Keith Massey, he's an ex-member of BSAR. He was a member back in the 1980s, so he was on the original search. And he saw the problem here. He knew that we needed to talk to this officer. This guy's key, and we need to talk to him to work out what he did actually see. He's a radio tech, and he's also his job was a telecoms engineer. He's a Telstra technician. So he had his overalls and his Telstra truck, and he'd go around and fix up your telephone line. So he went to Williamtown RAF base, came up to the security guard at the gate and said, I'm here to fix the phones in the control tower. And the guy went, no problem, mate. Here you go. So he went up to the control tower. He walked up the steps. He went up to the tower. And amazingly, the guy who was on the night the VH-MDX was down was on duty then as well, due to complete luck. And so he managed to actually talk to the operator who was actually on duty that night, which is really quite amazing. Unfortunately, what Keith talked about is not recorded, so we don't know what was said. And Keith died, I think it was 12 months ago, sadly, so we will not know. But good on him. And that is what the Williamtown Control Tower looked like. So that photo is from the 1970s. We believe that that radar system was still the one which was in place in 1981. So you can see the planned position indicator, so the radar display head, which is marked there. But the thing we want to point out is that the likely procedural position is kind of over here. So the radar's over there, and the procedural position is kind of the next desk over. And the important thing about this is that, if we just go to, well, yeah, go to the next page. So Glenn Horrocks interviewed the operator in 2014. So he managed to track him down and he had an interview with him. Interestingly enough, the day VH-MDX went down was the operator's first day on the job solo. So he just completed all the training with an instructor with him, and this was his first day where he was qualified to take it solo. So there you go. Also, he only turned the radar on because he, in inverted commas, thought it might be useful. There was no requirement for him to turn it on. He was doing procedural flight control, which is where an aircraft comes in, you ride it on a flight strip, you've got the type of aircraft, its speed, where it is, and then you've got the other flight strips of all of the other aircraft. You work it out between that. You're not doing it on the radar screen. So he's doing it on the desk with all these little bits of paper. And that's why he's at the procedural desk, not the radar. And so he only turned it on because he thought it might be useful. And he only went over to check the radar when Sydney Air Traffic Control said, "Can you see him?" And then he took the 2 steps over to the radar, had a look. "Yes, I can see him, 320 at 45. Then he took the steps back to the procedural desk and did that. So he never watched the radar screen again after that. So he wasn't watching to see whether it faded or not. So VH-MDX may well have, did travel further than that, but he didn't see that. So it looks like a lot of those original searches were based on his original 320 at 45, but VH-MDX flew for several minutes after that, and that's miles away from where he is. So we think that that did mislead the searchers quite considerably in that first early search. They did search wider than that. It's not that they entirely searched in that area, but a lot of resources were put there, more than they should have, because if they talked to the Sydney Air Traffic Control, which was watching it constantly, and those guys, they have people whose job is to watch that screen and watch all the things around. And as soon as you've got an aircraft in distress, not only will the operator be looking at it, but he'd be calling over the supervisor and the supervisor. So there'll be multiple people watching this, and they were all watching it. They were the ones who saw the radar fade. And so they're the ones who, when Sydney say we saw the radar fade at this location, they're the ones who actually saw where it got to as far as their radar could resolve, not Williamtown, because he wasn't watching that. And so that's a fundamental bit which Glen Horrocks' research has really focused in on, is that the 320-45 point is a good reference point several minutes before the actual crash. So it had several minutes of flight time after that. It's a good sort of starting point, but then you have to use that to extrapolate out for the speed and time which the aircraft was flying after that, heading towards the location which the Sydney radar went to. But because it's difficult to read accurately off the Sydney radar, you can't really use the Sydney radar as a point on the map. So the aftermath of this is that, so VH-MDX has never been found, so it is still an official open missing persons case. And there has been many, many people who've privately done investigations into this, and I mentioned a few of them there. There's many, many more. And they all have access to different amount of information, and I have issues with each one of their analyses. I won't go into that now because the focus is on the work which we're presenting, and the question is whether the work which we're presenting is on the money or not. But yes, I have. If anyone wants to talk about those issues after the presentation, I'm more than happy to. So the work that Glen Horrocks has done is focused on the Williamtown and Sydney radars. And I should, and so it's using the 320-45 from Williamtown point as the starting point of the analysis. Sydney radar observed that it was heading at approximately 070, so just a little bit north of east. We've got the wind, which was on that day. Obviously, when VH-MDX made the call of the 5,000-foot altitude, obviously it was still flying at that point of time, which is 1939-26, which is 3.5 minutes after the 320-45. But as I said, as we saw from its rate of descent, it's going to be crashing either within seconds or at the most a couple of minutes. So, and that's the sort of flight time range we're talking about there. Right, and this is the bit which kind of I added to this bit. So this is where, so Glen Horrocks has come up with that scenario. And the question is, well, then how do you then turn that into a realistic search area? And so I used a stochastic analysis. And so you've got that aircraft from the top left, you've got its position, you've got its direction, and so you can just draw a line, X marks the spots, that's where it is, let's go there, let's get it. It's never, ever that simple. It's never right. And that's because there's an uncertainty in range. You don't know the speed, you don't know the time. That's going to give you an uncertainty in the range. There's an uncertainty in the direction. You could be moving a bit to the left, a bit to the right. We don't really know. And they combine to really give you a probability distribution. There is no X marks the spot. It's not there. It's going to be a probability distribution, and that's going to cover some sort of an area. And the question is, so let's put in realistic ranges for the range of the speed, the range of the bearing, all of those other factors, and then let's work out what the real search areas actually are. And so these are the input variables which we use. So you've got the Williamtown Tower position, and that's exact, so we know that that's spot on, so there's no distribution about that. But the Williamtown fixed bearing, so it was 320 at 45, but with some later work by Glen, we think it's more like 324, and we were giving it a normal distribution with a standard deviation of 1. The range, 46.6, again, we've got, we homed in on that because of some reasons which are explained in the VH-MDX website. So if you want to have a look at the reasons for that, have a look at that for that. But again, we've got a normal distribution for that with a standard deviation of 0.4. The indicated airspeed, so that's the indicated airspeed is the speed which is indicated in the aircraft. So it's not ground speed, because that means that you've got not only things like the effect of the wind, but you've also got the effect of the altitude, because the altitude will change the way which the pitot tubes measure the speed. So the indicated airspeed, we've assumed that it's starting. So at the 1936 time, it's 125 knots with a standard deviation of 5. And then at 1939, we've assumed 110 with a standard deviation of 10. What we're assuming is that as he's getting down, he's pitching the aircraft more and more to try and get lift. He's still well above the stall speed of the aircraft. We know that he's not going to go near the stall speed. With ice, you can't do that because you'll stall and you'll go in. So you've got to be significantly above the normal stall speed. So that's our best guess of his the maximum lift which he can get out of the aircraft based on where he is. Heading 070, and so that's from the Sydney Air Traffic Control, and we've put a standard deviation of 10 on that. The time to crash, so we've estimated a mean of 236 seconds with a standard deviation of 20. And then what we've done is we've clipped that because if it's before the 5,000 call, then it's obviously not correct. And so with a stochastic analysis, when you run a Monte Carlo type approach, you can easily just remove the ones you don't want. So it's a bit of a biased distribution there, but that was our best guess as to what it was. The wind direction, so the wind speed and the wind direction. So I did a CFD model of the whole Barrington area, which I flowed the prevailing wind over, and then that gave us the detail of the wind in the valleys and all over that. So as the aircraft goes along its track, we actually extract the wind speed and direction from that CFD model so that we've got a more accurate and more detailed wind model in it. But then on top of that, we put this skew normal distribution for the direction and then a multiplying factor for the speed, because we don't know of any local variations in direction and speed. And so the idea is that these are all parameters which you can have educated guesses of what the actual distribution is, because estimating how they all combine to give you a search area is just extremely difficult, and it'd be analytically just about impossible. But using a Monte Carlo approach, it's quite tractable. It takes a bit of computing time, so the computer will think about that for a while. I was typically doing about 5 million iterations to do that. And the way that works is you just randomly take a sample out of your distributions. You then work out where that would end you up. That ends up in a point on the map. You do that 5 million times, and then you get a big distribution of points all over the map. then you effectively overlay a grid of that, and then you work out what the probability distribution is. So effectively, you count up how many points are in each square kilometre, or whatever the unit of the grid you're working. And what that does is it gives you things like this. And so that model, which I've just explained, gives you those probability distributions there. So you've got the red one, the green one, and the blue one. The maximum point is actually right there in the middle of that. Should also note that when you've got a probability distribution like this, if you take the nominal of each of those parameters we put in there, that often does not line up with the middle of the maximum probability. There's normally an offset. And so that's another key thing about this, is that if you have nonlinearities which pull the maximum probability point away from that nominal point, this will pick that up. But have a look at those probabilities. So the red one is 0.08% per square kilometre, and the blue one, the highest probability one, is 0.24% per kilometre. Now, up until a couple of years ago, if we had 20 people searching for a weekend, we'd search about 1 square kilometre. So this is suggesting that our probability of finding VH-MDX in one weekend, if we're searching in that blue region, is about 0.24%. So way, way less than 1%.
How big is that area?
How big's that area? I think it's about 40 square kilometres, that one, the blue one, yeah. And you can also see that because this is such a broad thing, there's still quite a bit of probability outside there. I should work out what the net probability of it being inside that blue, green and red rings are. I think you'll find that there's still an awful large amount of probability of being outside the red one, which means that the area to be searched is enormous. So what's Barrington like? So this is some photos from last May, I think it is. So you've got there, up the top, you've got Willem fighting through some vines there. There's plenty of that stuff to fight through. Down the bottom, now that's down at Danny's Creek. I'm down there with Andrew and Willem again. We're actually testing some satellite communications gear there in the pelting rain with the flooded creek behind us. And that was actually one of the most pleasant bits of the trip we did there, where it actually opened out and it wasn't too bad. In the middle at the bottom, yeah, that's pretty typical. And the one on the left, that is the Gloucester River. So the Gloucester River is big enough that it just punches a hole straight through the scrub. So you can see the scrub on both sides, but the river just punches a hole straight through it. So that's Andrew and Willem again on the right. That's climbing up to Mount Nelson on the left. Whenever there's disturbance, so you've got a big tree which is down there, the lantana just comes up so thick. So you can just see the lantana climbing all over that. And of course, if VH-MDX was at the bottom of that lantana, you just walk over it and you wouldn't even know, because it's your feet down there. So those last photos were down the bottom of the valleys and going up the valleys a little bit. As you start going up in altitude, because Barrington Tops gets quite high, gets up to 1,500 metres high, these photos are up around the 1,000 to 1,200 metre mark. And when you get higher, it starts easing off a bit. So you can see here the terrain is much nicer. And you might also see that there's some aircraft wreckage up there. So what we do is we use this as a search and rescue exercise for our squad. And we've got some bits of aircraft wreckage. So we go out there and plant them in the bush, so we can guarantee that our teams find some aircraft wreckage, because we've put them there. And if they miss it, we go tell them to go back and get it. So these are bits of wreckage which we've planted out there. But it's a good idea of the sort of visibility of that area. And as you can see, that as you start going up in altitude, the terrain does start easing off. You get more visibility. You can move through it easier. But you can also see how steep it is. It's like some of those photos like are 45 degrees steep. So they're very steep country. And as you go higher still, you can see me there up in the subalpine region. So that's up around the 1,300 metres, looking very happy. You'll see that 1,300 metres, the canopy opens right out. And so I'm in a big valley there, which is just completely filled with coral fern. If there's one thing I'm certain of, it is that VH-MDX is not in the subalpine region. It's because if VH-MDX had crashed in terrain like that, it would have been seen by aircraft. So all I can say is that it is definitely down in the region where the canopy is complete, somewhere where it would punch in through the canopy and then disappear from aircraft. So it was a jolly old walk up on the subalpine stuff, but VH-MDX isn't going to be there. So we don't spend much time up there, unfortunately. It's nicer there. All right, well, this is a video which we made in 2013. So it is a little bit old. It also predates our association with the SES. We're a volunteer rescue association, VRA unit back then. So you'll see a lot of white uniforms with green highlights. That's the VRA uniform. But it covers a number of issues which are useful to see. It's got the few little shorts from the air traffic control transcript, a few of the key players on the search, and you get to see a few bits of people having fun in Barrington Scrub. Let's see if this works for us.
MDX was a system which flew from Culminating Airport to Bankstown Airport on the 9th of August 1981. Australia's biggest aviation history, essentially. It's the only aircraft that's crashed on mainland Australia that's yet to be found. We were involved in the original 1981 search. We had a big contingent back then. There's been a little bit of information, quite limited about what happened and where, and a lot of people have got their own sort of ideas of what happened. What's new for this search is that police rescue have really come on board in a big way, and this has allowed us to research the evidence behind this crash to a much greater detail than we've ever been possible to do before.
We've conducted probably 2 recce's over the last couple of months, and they're extremely important to us because we're worried about safety for our crew and also ease of access to actually get into it.
Especially establish our suitable location for a medical floor command post so that we can support the operation and also look at medevac possibilities both from road and also ELO options as well.
6 weeks ago, I found some stuff in the National Archives and previously had been released that contained a lot of new information. We found from the UTM radar at that point on page 43 of the National Archive, and going back and analysing it as close to accurately as possible, and then using some of the newer technology that's available today, like LiDAR, which wasn't available back in the original search day, gives us a better than average chance of finding it. We use Google Earth as a tool to visualise what the flight path looked over the ground, which means that you can have a look at how the altitude is tracking against the ground. And that has allowed us, particularly in the final couple of minutes of this flight, where he's getting into some very mountainous terrain, is to really limit the area down to where he's likely to be.
'We're really excited with the state rescue board activity. We've got police rescue across New South Wales. We've got the Rural Fire Service, State Emergency Service, Volunteer Rescue Association, with the Y Service, the VRA Wilderness Rescue Squad, National Parks and Wildlife, the Ambulance Service of New South Wales, and also the Royal Australian Air Force. 2013 is really going to be the year for it because there's a concerted effort by a lot of professional organisations that have a bit of not only have a professional but also a personal interest in finding it.
So we'll be looking at our remote area firefighters aiming for this operation. So those are all trained in navigation, bushwalk and bushcraft. They're also undertake vehicles and pack tests every year, so they have a level of fitness.
I'm looking for people who have experience in overnight walking, being prepared to stay out overnight, extreme fitness or high levels of fitness, and also preferably people with vertical experience as well. The terrain is extreme. and I think that it's going to push those who are not prepared for it.
Place nature of wanting to know the end to a story.
So the thing that pulls me to the area, the first thing really has to do with family is that there's men up there didn't make homes, their families are from.
Obviously, our main objective is to try and locate this aircraft. There's still 5 souls on board, and we want to try and give some closure to the families. A secondary objective is to also exercise, coordinate, and test all our BSAR land search and rescue capabilities in a remote area. This is a very challenging and complex environment.
Thanks, Caro, for putting that film together. So that was a piece which Caro got together for our 2013 exercise. Oops. Doing it again. There we go. Very good. So what have we done? So that's what we've done since 2013. So I'll first of all point out that in the 2013, Glen Horrocks only came on board in 2014. So Glen Horrocks was not there, unfortunately. But since then, that's what we've done. So they're our search tracks. We've covered a lot of ground, but we got a hell of a lot more to go. So it's going to take a while. And by a while, I mean decades. So the country is inhospitable. It's very slow. It's very rough. It's the sort of country where you can only really put in really fit, strong people. So there's not a huge amount of people who can go into that sort of terrain. So it's a very slow process. Which brings up to the point, well, how are we going to find it? And in my opinion, and I'm no expert here, but I think remote sensing is the only way which we're going to find it before I'm old and grey, which arguably I already am, but anyway. So aerial photography, I think that's highly unlikely. The canopy is just too thick. It's been flown over by aircraft hundreds of times. So if it was visible from the air, it would have already been seen. So I don't think aerial photography is the way to go. Chemical sampling of the watercourses. We actually did a trial of that back in 2015. Particularly, we were looking for lead because the aviation fuel's got a lot of lead in it. That gave inconclusive results, but after more than 40 years, you'd think you'd be pushing it with that. LiDAR, well, there's a lot of public domain LiDAR available information now. It's on the Elvis LiDAR website. You've got the whole state there. But I've looked at that extensively, and the public domain LiDAR data is just not good enough to resolve what's underneath the canopy. And the reason I say that is because up in Barrington Tops, there's plenty of areas where you've got things like picnic shelters, national park signboards, water tanks, just all this normal sort of stuff which national parks have around. So I know where they are. When I look for those, I can't find them. So if they can't resolve big buildings, which I know are there, then it's got no chance of resolving an aircraft, which is just going to be a crumpled heap. Magnetometry. There's a photo up there of Don Redford's crowd who've tried magnetometry over Barrington Tops. I'm very dubious that that's going to work. From my research into that, I understand that the detection range of that is too short. It's of the order of 10 to 30 metres, and given the trees are generally taller than that, in other words, by the time you've got the sensor above the trees, you're out of its detection range. So from my understanding of that technology, it's unlikely to work. Radar, synthetic aperture radar, things like that. So the standard synthetic aperture radar with radio frequencies up in the gigahertz band, the foliage stops that penetration of that. So you can't see the foliage. You can't see through the foliage, which means that, again, it's no better than aerial photography. Hyperspectral imagery. And so that's imagery where you're looking at the whole spectrum all the way from ultraviolet through to infrared. there's a possibility that VH-MDX could have a different thermal signature to the surrounding ground, so it might come up in some thermal bands. But again, if that was visible from the air, I think it would have been seen aerially. So I'm not very hopeful about that. And in my opinion, the only remote sensing technology which has got any of hope of working is one called foliage penetrating radar, which we'll just get onto here. So it's synthetic aperture radar, and synthetic aperture radar means it's the radar which uses the motion of the radar head to effectively do the sweep. And it's operating in the VHF spectrum. So most radars operate in the gigahertz spectrum. This one's operating in the sort of VHF 100 megahertz sort of range. And in that range, a lot of foliage, timber, things like that are transparent. So they can look through foliage. And there's an example there from an IAAA paper where they've got some targets which are in a forested area. And you can see that with VHF synthetic aperture radar, well, nothing's very clear, nothing's 100%, but there are certainly some returns which are coming out there, which means that, for instance, if you ran a system like that over Barrington Top and said, well, I've got 10 fuzzy blobs there, I don't know what it is, fine, I'll go and visit those 10 fuzzy. It's better than searching the whole national park, which is what we're doing at the moment. So there's military systems which use this, manufactured by Saab, Elbit, Lockheed Martin. They're used for military operations for finding bad guys in jungle. That's their main purpose in life. And because of that, that means that they're military systems which are very difficult to access and are generally classified. I have actually phoned up Saab and asked them about their Carabas system. Carabas is the system which Saab developed, which was available about 10 years ago. And they actually had a demonstrator which could strap onto a Bell Robinson 22, I think it was. And I talked to them about it. And funnily enough, they weren't very interested in talking to me. I wasn't about to give them a sale, so I don't think they weren't too interested. But they did actually mention that they had run their system over an aircraft crash in Thailand in the jungle. And his comment was that it wasn't very successful. So, okay, who knows? But from my understanding of the remote sensing technology, the foliage penetrating radar really is the only one which I think has got any hope. But I'm no expert in this area. I'm very happy to talk to anyone who's got some ideas of how it could be found, and I am all ears. And so, thank you for attending the talk. I hope it was entertaining for you, and I hope at the end of the day we find them. Any questions?